the golden age of television, when cowboys reigned supreme and black and white sets flickered with stories of grit and glory, one name stood out like a gunshot in the desert: Hugh O'Brian. Tall, chiseled, and radiating old-school masculinity, he was the face of law and order in the Wild West before Clint Eastwood whispered a word. The origins of a maverick-born Hugh Charles Cramp, the man who would become Hugh O'Brian, was never meant to ride into the sunset wearing cowboy boots. His father was an officer in the Marine Corps, and discipline was the unspoken law of the household. From a young age, Hugh was expected to lead, to endure, and to succeed. But even as a boy, there was something magnetic about him, an innate charisma and intelligence that made him destined for something beyond conventional paths. Raised in Illinois and then in California, Hugh excelled at academics and athletics alike. At the University of California, he majored in law and was a star athlete, standing out with his tall stature and clean-cut looks. But when World War II broke out, his destiny took a hard left turn. At the age of just 17, he became one of the youngest drill instructors in United States Marine Corps history. Let that sink in. While most teenagers were worried about dances and grades, Hugh was barking orders, molding men, and preparing them for war. This period would shape him profoundly. The military instilled in him the discipline and sense of purpose that would later define both his career and personal mission. But at the end of the war, as the dust settled and America entered its post-war boom, Hugh faced a dilemma. Should he return to law school and follow a conventional path, or dare to dream of something else? A chance encounter that changed everything. Fate has a strange way of intervening in the lives of men who seem made for greatness. Hugh's path to Hollywood wasn't carefully charted. It came by accident or destiny, depending on how you look at it. He accompanied a friend to an audition, and somehow the producers noticed him. Maybe it was the way he held himself, maybe it was his baritone voice, or maybe it was just that ineffable something. Either way, he got the part, and with it, he was hooked. He began acting under his real name, Hugh Cramp, but soon realized that it lacked the marketable punch Hollywood demanded. So, in an inspired move, he adopted his mother's maiden name, O'Brian. Hugh O'Brian was born, and so was a legend. In the early 1950s, he began appearing in supporting roles in films like Broken Lance, The Lawless Breed, and There's No Business Like Show Business. While he wasn't a household name yet, he exuded a quiet confidence, a mix of intellect and rugged charm that made people take notice. The life and legend of Wyatt Earp, A Star is Forged. In 1955, O'Brian landed the role that would define his career, Wyatt Earp, in the groundbreaking TV series The Life and Legend of Wyatt Earp. At the time, Westerns were the bedrock of American television, but none had attempted to dramatize the life of a real historical figure in such serialized detail. It was the first television Western to use an adult, character-driven format, portraying Earp not as a caricature, but as a complex, principled man struggling to uphold the law in an unruly land. Hugh didn't just act the part, he became Earp. Standing 6 feet tall with steely eyes and a commanding voice, O'Brian gave Earp a gravitas that audiences had never seen before. He brought intellectual rigor to the role, researching the real-life Earp, insisting on authenticity in the character's motivations, and wearing a custom-made coat with a long tail that became his visual trademark. For 6 seasons, from 1955 to 1961, Hugh O'Brian dominated the airwaves. The show was a massive hit and inspired legions of imitators. Along with Gunsmoke, it helped transition the Western genre from simplistic shootouts to morally complex stories about justice, personal code, and the burden of authority. Children idolized him, men respected him, and women adored him. But O'Brian didn't just play a lawman, he lived like one too. Off-screen, he was known for his integrity and his refusal to be swallowed by Hollywood excess. Unlike many of his contemporaries, he stayed grounded and fiercely private. Hollywood's thinking cowboy. What made O'Brian different was his mind. He wasn't just a pretty face or a two-dimensional cowboy. He read voraciously. He quoted philosophers. He was deeply invested in the social and intellectual movements of the time. He took part in charity events, spoke at universities, and even began cultivating ideas for global impact years before it was fashionable for celebrities to do so. He once said, "A thinking cowboy, that was the greatest compliment I ever got. That I was portraying Wyatt Earp as a man who used his head, not just his gun." This cerebral approach to stardom set him apart. While his co-stars in the Western genre were often pigeonholed, O'Brian seemed determined to break the mold. But therein lay the beginning of his professional dilemma. As television evolved into color and youth-oriented programming in the late 1960s, O'Brien's serious, austere image began to seem out of place. The new generation didn't want thinkers. They wanted rebels, radicals, and anti-heroes. And O'Brian was none of those. The slow drift from the spotlight. By the late 1960s, the Western was beginning to fade. Shows like Star Trek Mission Impossible and later All in the Family signaled a cultural shift. The gun-slinging lawman of the 1880s was no longer the American ideal. For Hugh O'Brian, the timing couldn't have been worse. After Wyatt Earp ended in 1961, he took on a string of roles in lesser-known films and television shows, guest spots on The Virginian, Fantasy Island, Charlie's Angels, and a few made-for-TV movies. He even played Sherlock Holmes in a 1972 TV movie, a daring departure from the frontier to foggy London streets. But the truth was unavoidable. Hollywood didn't know what to do with him anymore. He was too thoughtful for action roles, too old school for the new Hollywood auteurs, and too stoic for comedy. As the 1970s wore on, O'Brian found himself retreating from the mainstream spotlight. But here's the twist. He didn't fade in bitterness. He faded in purpose. Beyond fame. The HOBY legacy begins. During the peak of his fame, something profound had happened to Hugh O'Brian that would define the rest of his life far more than his acting career. In 1958, he spent 9 days in Africa with Dr. Albert Schweitzer, the Nobel Prize-winning humanitarian. That experience changed him forever. He saw what real leadership, compassion, and service could accomplish. When he returned to America, O'Brian didn't just go back to making westerns. He founded HOBY, the Hugh O'Brian Youth Leadership Program, aimed at inspiring high school sophomores to become future leaders. What started as a small conference grew into a global organization, helping over 500,000 young people discover their potential and passion for service. From Hollywood to HOBY, a new kind of stage. By the 1970s, Hugh O'Brian was no longer a weekly presence in American living rooms. He had gone from being one of television's biggest stars to an almost mythical figure, occasionally seen on magazine covers or game shows, but no longer part of the cultural bloodstream. And that was intentional. Instead of chasing roles that didn't speak to him, O'Brian channeled his energy into HOBY, the youth leadership foundation he had created in 1958. What began as a small gathering of high schoolers soon exploded into a global movement. Every year, thousands of students attended HOBY seminars across America and abroad, where they were encouraged to think critically, act compassionately, and lead courageously. Hugh was not a symbolic founder. He was involved, hands-on, and relentless in his belief that tomorrow's leaders needed purpose, not just ambition. He once said, "If you're lucky enough to live in a free society, you're lucky enough to give back." And give back he did. In the decades that followed, HOBY became a rite of passage for future politicians, entrepreneurs, teachers, and changemakers. Hugh would often appear in person, delivering speeches in his iconic baritone voice, still towering and sharp-eyed, commanding a room of teenagers like a general reviewing his troops. To many of them, he wasn't just a former actor, he was Wyatt Earp come to life, urging them to do right by their communities. This became his new stage, but fame, even when resisted, has a long memory, and it wasn't quite finished with Hugh. Hollywood remembered and tried to bring him back. Though Hugh stepped away from the Hollywood spotlight, the industry hadn't forgotten him. In the 1980s and 90s, a wave of nostalgia swept across America. Old westerns were back on cable. Classic TV reruns flourished. Suddenly, networks wanted to revisit the cowboy era. Producers approached O'Brian with offers, appearances, guest spots. He cautiously returned on Fantasy Island, Murder, She Wrote, and The Love Boat. In 1988, he even reprised his legendary role as Wyatt Earp in the made-for-TV movie The Gambler Returns, The Luck of the Draw, starring Kenny Rogers. This was a television event, reuniting legendary Western figures like Bat Masterson, the Lone Ranger, and yes, Wyatt Earp. Fans cheered. Critics applauded the nostalgia, but Hugh didn't use it to launch a comeback. To him, it was a tip of the hat, a respectful encore, not a revival. There were a few more TV movies and cameos. In 1994, he played Justice Roberts in Paradise, and a few scattered appearances followed. But the truth was clear. Hugh O'Brian was content to remain a man of the past, not an actor clinging to relevance. Still, something about Hugh's presence felt timeless. His dignified bearing, his clean lifestyle. He was known for his avoidance of Hollywood's more destructive vices, and his unwavering sense of mission made him larger than life, even as the spotlight dimmed. And then came the surprise that caught everyone off guard. The Bachelor Who Waited. 81 years, for decades, Hugh O'Brian was one of Hollywood's most notorious bachelors. He dated a lot. Elizabeth Taylor, Anne Margaret, Debbie Reynolds, even longtime companion Virginia Barber. His romances were legendary, but none stuck. Rumors circulated that he was too independent, too mission-driven, too married to HOBY. He often deflected questions about marriage with jokes or cryptic smiles. In interviews, O'Brian downplayed the romance. He said it just felt like the right time, but those close to him knew the deeper truth. In his twilight years, he wanted to share his legacy with someone he trusted, someone who had supported his life's mission, someone who had waited. The wedding took place at the Forest Lawn Memorial Park Chapel in California. It was intimate, simple, and dignified, just like the man himself. The guest list included a mix of family, friends, and HOBY alumni. That day, the cowboy who had preached duty over desire finally allowed himself a personal joy. The man behind the gun belt. In interviews later in life, Hugh O'Brian opened up more about his regrets, his struggles, and the complexity of being a public icon. He admitted he sometimes missed the energy of Hollywood, the rush of performance, the thrill of creation, but he was also deeply fulfilled by the legacy he had built beyond the screen. Still, there were shadows in his later years. He suffered from hearing loss and minor health issues. Some close to him described his frustration with the speed of the modern world. He disdained celebrity culture's obsession with scandal. He believed in earning attention, not demanding it. He once remarked in a 2012 interview, "I was a star for 6 years. I've been a servant for 60. Guess which one I sleep better with at night?" He stayed active in HOBY well into his 80s. At events, he was treated like royalty. Teenagers listened to him with awe, not because he was a relic of TV history, but because he believed in them. This, more than any Emmy or film credit, was his true calling, inspiring purpose in others. Approaching the final ride by the mid-2010s, Hugh began to withdraw even further from public life. He and Virginia lived quietly. HOBY continued under new leadership, but always bore his imprint. Fans still wrote letters, collectors asked for signed memorabilia, and The Life and Legend of Wyatt Earp continued to air in syndication, reminding the world of the cowboy who spoke softly but carried a badge. On September 5th, 2016, Hugh O'Brian passed away at the age of 91. The announcement came not from Hollywood, but from HOBY. The world mourned. Tributes poured in, from fans, from actors, from politicians, and especially from generations of young people who credited him for changing their lives. He was cremated and his ashes buried at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale, California, the same place where he had married just 10 years earlier. By the time Hugh O'Brian passed away in 2016 at the age of 91, his place in history was both secure and fading, a strange paradox that often befalls legends who outlive their own mythologies. His name no longer trended on entertainment headlines. Young audiences knew the names of Marvel superheroes, but not the man who once embodied the American ideal of duty, order, and moral strength. The Wyatt Earp effect, a moral blueprint. Let's start with his most enduring creation, Wyatt Earp. For 6 seasons, 1955 to 1961, the life and legend of Wyatt Earp wasn't just a Western, it was a lesson in American character. At a time when television was still learning how to shape hearts and minds, Hugh O'Brian's portrayal of Earp established a clear blueprint. Law matters. Morality matters. Justice is complicated but worth fighting for. These themes seem quaint today, in an era of anti-heroes and morally ambiguous protagonists, but in post-war America, they were revolutionary. Unlike trigger-happy gunslingers, O'Brian's Earp often avoided violence unless it was the last resort. He reasoned before reacting. He tried to outthink his adversaries, not just outdraw them. And it wasn't just a script decision. That approach reflected Hugh himself, a man who read philosophy, volunteered with youth, and believed deeply in personal accountability. Earp's coat might have had a dramatic flair, but the soul behind the badge was authentic. Hugh believed in what he portrayed, and America for a while believed with him. Today, if you look closely at characters like Captain America, early Superman, or even modern procedurals like Blue Bloods, the DNA of Hugh O'Brian's Earp is still quietly there. The forgotten cowboy. Why Hollywood moved on. But as decades passed, Hollywood changed. The era of clean-cut heroes gave way to gritty realism. The Vietnam War, Watergate, and cultural revolutions of the 60s and 70s dismantled the myth of the noble lawman. In came Clint Eastwood's Man with No Name. In came the moral chaos of Breaking Bad, The Sopranos, The Wire. Against this backdrop, Hugh O'Brian's image no longer fit. He wasn't ironic. He wasn't cynical. He wasn't complicated in a tortured way. He was clear-eyed and moral and, perhaps most damningly, earnest. And in Hollywood, earnest doesn't age well. So his name was gradually left out of retrospectives. He wasn't invited to all the Western reunions. He was occasionally referenced as a footnote, a black and white echo of a simpler time. But the truth is that Hollywood didn't know how to honor Hugh O'Brian because he never played the game. He left quietly, didn't self-destruct, didn't become tabloid fodder, and didn't demand attention. He just kept doing good. HOBY, the Invisible Empire. While the Hollywood spotlight faded, another spotlight grew, just in a different direction. By the 1990s and 2000s, HOBY had become one of the most respected youth leadership programs in the world. Alumni included future senators, CEOs, military leaders, and nonprofit founders. And what made HOBY so unique? It wasn't about academic perfection. It wasn't about resumes. It was about values. Students were chosen because they showed potential for influence. Then they were immersed in a culture of service, public speaking, ethical debate, and visionary thinking. To many of these teenagers, Hugh O'Brian wasn't a celebrity. He was a mentor. They remember his stories, his presence, his jokes, his warnings about apathy and the erosion of civic engagement. One former student recalled him saying, "Don't just be smart, be useful. Don't just succeed, lead." This philosophy shaped hundreds of thousands of lives, quietly, without fanfare, without a Netflix special or media campaign. In many ways, HOBY was Hugh's true masterpiece, far greater than any television role. It was a legacy built to outlast fame. Could a Hugh O'Brian exist today? This question stings with relevance in 2025. Could someone like Hugh O'Brian thrive in modern Hollywood or even modern society? Consider this. He was deeply patriotic, but not jingoistic. He was masculine without being toxic. He was religious, but never sanctimonious. He believed in service, humility, discipline, and action without spectacle. In today's age of social media influencers, viral fame, and outrage-driven algorithms, a man like O'Brian would be an anomaly. He'd probably be mocked as too wholesome or too square. He'd be advised to get edgier, go viral, or manufacture controversy. But maybe that's precisely why we need another Hugh O'Brian. In a world where attention is often divorced from virtue, where celebrity is stripped of responsibility, the O'Brian model reminds us of something different. You don't need to be loud to be strong. You don't need to be famous to be remembered. So, what the hell happened to Hugh O'Brian? He lived honorably. He walked away from fame. He gave his life to something bigger than himself. And if we're wise, we won't just remember Hugh O'Brian. We'll become a little more like him.